612 ABC Radio Brisbane. Now we're talking.
20 years ago last month, Queensland saw what was probably one of the most shocking commissions of inquiry into the health system. It led to severe criticism of two state Labor health ministers, Wendy Edmund and Gordon Nuttall. The Commissioner Davies, was scathing, though, of both sides of politics in Queensland. The report led to severe criticism of a number of doctors employed by Queensland Health. Findings of deliberate and ongoing culture of cover-up in Queensland Health, a litany of failures at the Bundaberg Base Hospital were revealed. Peter Beattie was Premier at the time. 20 years on, key players believe that the inquiry was mishandled and the doctor at the centre of fraud allegations, Dr Jayant Patel, should have been charged with more severe charges. Rob Messenger was the local state National Party MP at the time. I interviewed him this week about his recollection of what happened and if he felt justice was done.
Well, it first came to me via Toni Hoffman. She was a nurse who blew the whistle. She came into my, had an appointment with me one Friday afternoon, and she came into the office. She sat down and handed me a document that she'd written. It was a formal complaint that was written probably the October before. So she came to me on a Friday, I think it was 18th of March 2005, five. I'd been elected in 2004 in the February, so I'd been in business as a politician for about a year. And then, she came in and sat down, and we went through this process where I'd been formerly an ABC presenter, similar to yourself, a radio host, broadcaster. So I went through a procedure where we talked through what her issues were. I was really surprised, to say the least. And then I had a tape recorder, a fairly good quality tape recorder, and I asked her if it was okay if we could conduct a recorded interview. And she said yes. Now, that was the first time then and there that I realised how serious it was, because, as you know, Steve, if people aren't willing to be recorded, then they don't have credibility when they're making whistleblower complaints. And as soon as a whistleblower says, yeah, I'm happy to go on the record, then you know that there's a level of credibility there. So I knew we were dealing with something very seriously.
You eventually revealed what you'd been told by Toni Hoffman in state parliament as the local state member of parliament. You were a member of the National Party. There was a Labor government in control, Peter Beattie's government. What was the reaction of Parliament when you first made the allegations on the floor of the House?
The reactions on the floor of the House were similar to the reactions that I got in the May previous, when I'd taken 3 whistleblowing nurses into Parliament. They were from the mental health unit in Bundaberg. And the reaction there was disbelief and anger.
As I understand it, when you raised this stuff in Parliament, you were ridiculed and lampooned by the government of the day.
Yes, they started gaslighting me straight away, and also trying to find out the name of the whistleblower. So I knew I had to protect Toni. So in those first few weeks before Hedley Thomas's brilliant sleuthing and final news reports that blew the whistle entirely on it, there was a lot of pressure. I mean, the AMA themselves came out and issued press releases indicating that, smearing my name, indicating that I got the deaths, the blood of 5 teenage road accident victims around the Easter break on my hands. They said they wrote an article that said I'd sunk lower than a bathysphere. The letter-writing campaign ramped up to my local paper. The union wrote against me. The manager of the hospital wrote letters against me. The hospital board wrote letters against me. Doctors wrote letters against me. And it became lonely for a little while. I didn't have too many friends.
So when you when you had evidence from experienced intensive care nurses and mental health nurses that something was very wrong, at a hospital under the management of the Queensland Health Department, the first response was not to investigate, not to look at what the professional staff has said, but to attack the messenger, in your case, literally, Rob Messenger, the local member of State Parliament?
Yes, I mean, the Labor government, in my research now, and, you know, when you look at the primary evidence, the Labor government knew exactly what was happening at the Bundaberg Hospital for at least 7 months to a year before Toni came and spoke with me and blew the whistle, and deliberately covered up the deaths, the patient harm, the abuse of office, the corruption, the torture which Patel put victims through, and allowed Patel to continue assaulting, killing patients, torturing patients, sexually harassing medical workers. I mean, it was far worse than what people even these days realise. I mean, the general narrative is that he was just an incompetent doctor operating outside his area of expertise. And there were hundreds of other patients that were traumatised, scores of nurses and other health workers that were damaged as part of that whole cover-up.
Their official report was that he was responsible in particular for a range of deaths. 13 were of particular note, and 7 to 8 where the treatment was just outlandish and involved absolutely non-defendable processes, quote unquote. I'm quoting the statement by Bob Douglas, SC, who was counsel assisting the inquiry.
The evidence before the Davies Royal Commission showed that Patel operated on patients without anaesthetic, and the patients were screaming.
You believe that Queensland made a mistake at that time, that because Dr. Jayant Patel was not properly registered as a doctor in Queensland, he should have been charged under Section 245 of the Criminal Code rather than being treated as a medical malpractice or maladministration matter. Tell me why, Rob Messenger.
Well, the legal strategy that the Crown Law adopted was that they took before the juries this question. They asked the jury this question: was this operation necessary? When in fact the question they should have asked the jury was this operation legal? They presupposed that Patel was a properly registered doctor, and he wasn't. He wasn't properly registered for 2 main points. Firstly, there was fraud involved in his registration. And Section 245 of the Criminal Code says that assault occurs when fraud occurs.
And so Patel pleaded guilty to fraud, didn't he? Jayant Patel pleaded guilty to fraud.
Yes. So the definition of assault under 245 says a person who strikes, touches or moves or otherwise applies force of any kind to the person of another, either directly or indirectly, without the other person's consent, or, this is the important part, with the other person's consent if the consent is obtained by fraud. So clearly, proper consent wasn't given by 1,500 patients, and assault occurred to 1,500 patients. Why did the Crown Law adopt a strategy which assumed that he was a properly registered doctor? The other point, that he was neither credentialed, privileged or registered at the hospital itself. So that was another reason why he wasn't properly registered.
My guest is Rob Messenger, former state member of Parliament of Queensland. This is 612 ABC Brisbane. It was the work of Mr Messenger as the local member of Parliament that helped get the revelations or the nursing and the hospital staff concerns about Jayant Patel, a man who was working as a doctor at Bundaberg-based hospital 20 years ago, exposed and charged. I want you to tell me briefly the circumstances around one particular death at the hospital. Mr Des Bramich, a sentinel event as it's known. You believe that police should have pursued more serious charges in relation to the death of Des Bramich, who, after he got out of intensive care and was improving after Jayant Patel treated him, he died. Tell the story.
Yes. Well, the best or worst example of the cover-up was Des's death. Now, the reason that Toni largely walked into my office was the murder, well, I allege is the murder of Des Bramich. So Des was a chest crush injury. He was under his caravan changing tyres on a Sunday afternoon. The support slipped away. The caravan crushed his chest. His son, Mark, rescued him, and then he was rescued by emergency services and flown to the Bundaberg Base Hospital on the Sunday evening. He was admitted to the ICU, where in the next 24 hours he made a remarkable recovery. Toni wasn't there when he got there, but she was there the following day, and he was discharged from the ICU at around 3 o'clock on the Monday. He was admitted to the surgical ward, and he was so full of good health that the local newspaper interviewed him on the Tuesday morning at around 10 a.m. And there's a big photo in the newspaper. They're sitting up with his missus, Tess, holding hands and saying about the miraculous rescue that he had. At about straight after the interview with the newspaper, he was pulled out of bed on the orders of a doctor and walked around the hospital ward, in surgical ward. Shortly after he was walked around the ward, his condition deteriorated to the point where he had to be readmitted to the ICU. Toni Hoffman at that point ordered a medevac flight from Brisbane. She knew she had to get him to Brisbane to a better level of care. She waited and waited on that day. That was the Tuesday, the 26th. And then Patel took over treatment. That night, Patel performed a procedure where, against all advice and against the test that they did, Patel insisted that there was fluid building up in the heart around the pericardial sac, the sac that holds the heart. Everyone said, no, there's no test that shows that, but Patel insisted. And he performed this procedure, which was supposed to be done with a fine needle. It was where a needle's carefully inserted into the pericardial sac holding the heart, and the excess fluid around in the sac is drained gently out. Patel stabbed violently Des Bramich in the chest more than 50 times with a 6-inch wide-bore needle. And an hour after that procedure, Des passed away as a result of a heart attack. That has never been explained why, in the whole of the legal process, Des Bramich's death was never, as part of the official charge, Patel was never charged with Des Bramich's death. There's a big question mark there of why.
This is ABC Radio Brisbane. You're hearing the voice of Rob Messenger, who 20 years ago was the state member of Parliament for the area, which took in the Bundaberg Base Hospital. He's recounting details of the circumstances around events at the Bundaberg Base Hospital 2 decades ago that led to a commission of inquiry in which all sides of politics were criticised. My name's Steve Austin. It's 9 minutes to 11. Let's go to Rob Messenger again.
The Premier today has to explain why Patel wasn't charged with the murder of Des Bramich, and if he can't do that, then he has to do something about it. I just remind you, there's no statute of limitation on murder or manslaughter.
My guest is Rob Messenger, former State National Party Member of Parliament at the time, intimately involved in the exposure of the horrors that took place at the Bundaberg Hospital 20 years ago. The inquiry, the Davies inquiry, found that there was a culture, and I'm quoting, a culture of concealment within and pertaining to Queensland Health. That the Commissioner, the Davies, was scathing in his criticism of the government, of successive governments, of each political hue, and former health ministers Wendy Edmund and Gordon Nuttall. The counsel assisting the inquiry, Bob Douglas SC, wrote a summary of the Davies inquiry, and in his concluding remarks he says Jayant Patel unfortunately has slipped through the net, misrepresenting his disciplinary history. He goes on to say his malpractice, however, exposed a raft of deficiencies in the health system in Queensland and the inimical results of medical and nursing staff shortages. The bottom line is that the burden of responsibility by Bob Douglas is really placed upon the state government and the health department at the time. Do you agree?
Yes, but there's more than just the health department that failed. The Justice Department and the lawyers and the police who investigated at the time, they also failed. And I'll just refer you back to the case of Des Bramich. I mean, you have a patient who was stabbed frenziedly in the chest 50 times with a 6-inch needle by a person who wasn't a registered doctor, a properly registered doctor, and died an hour after the stabbing from allegedly a heart attack. And yet there was no criminal charges laid against Patel for that particular patient's death.
Rob Messenger, there was a compensation scheme for victims of Jayant Patel in the Queensland health system, but I understand you have some very deep concerns about the end result of that compensation scheme. What are they?
Overall, only around 300 patients were given special compensation. They didn't have to go before a court. It was a special compensation scheme that was set up by Peter Beattie. It averaged out about, the average compensation was around $21,000. Now, there were some patients who received hundreds of thousands, but for the most, and I spoke with many widows and widowers, they were given the ultimatum of take this $10,000 or $15,000 and that's it. So they barely were compensated enough money to cover the cost of a funeral. And the lawyers who were tasked to facilitate the government's special compensation process were given a $7,000 flat fee. So the government, instead of paying out hundreds of millions of dollars, as they should have, to all 1,500 people who were all assaulted by a non-doctor, only around 300 to maximum 400 were selected for compensation, and they received peanuts. I can give you a comparison. I did a calculation on the Manus Island detainees who won a class action. On average, they received around $70,000.
So 20 years on, what do you think we've learnt from what took place at the Bundaberg Hospital?
What we've learnt is that while the system seems to have improved, the registration system and the protection system for patients, it's gone from a state-based system to a national-based system, and that's under the AHPRA, AHPRA, which is Australian Health Practitioners Registration Authority. But in reality, the national system is as flawed as the state system, and it's flawed for the following reasons. AHPRA, while empowered by federal legislation and state legislation, is run by doctors, funded by doctors, and you implicitly have doctors disciplining doctors. Even though there's a federal health website which you can look up every doctor and every healthcare provider in Australia and see their disciplinary record, I have evidence that disciplinary record online under AHPRA isn't accurate, that it's actually flawed, and doctors on AHPRA's website that have far worse disciplinary records that are listed publicly. The other problem is, I'll just go back to whistleblower protection. Whistleblowers aren't protected. There needs to be something like a whistleblower income protection insurance, so that whistleblowers, when they're genuine, that they are given free legal advice and protection. And if they're genuine, their income should be protected, similar to, disability or sickness income.
I'll leave it there. Rob Messenger, thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, Steve.
Rob Messenger was the State National Party MP at the time for the electorate that took in the Bundaberg-based hospital 20 years ago last month, resulted in a commission of inquiry that was shut down due to apprehended bias. It was then restarted after Justice Thomas said, look, you can still use the evidence and have another inquiry. So Justice Davies took over, delivered his report, which was scathing of two Labor health ministers, Wendy Edmund and Gordon Nuttall. Gordon Nuttall has now passed away. Scathing of both sides of politics, scathing of the culture in Queensland health, and really severely critical of a number of qualified and quite reputable, supposedly doctors employed by Queensland Health at the time.